Welcome to this fourth session of TNI's Fracture series, a teaching series where we're trying to get a better understanding of this fractured world that we're living in. Things are changing and we need to understand them. Neoliberalism is cracking apart, age-old alliances are being abandoned, fascist leaders are coming to power, repression is escalating, marginalized communities are being targeted all over with brutal force, and social justice movements are on the backhand. What can we do to change the situation? The best thing we can do at the beginning is to understand what is going on. And this is the reason for these internationalist teachings brought to you by the Transnational Institute and our partners that we're working with together in this series, the Asia Europe People's Forum, Noor, a feminist think tank, Alternative Information and Development Center, a global network of movement lawyers. My name is Shaun Macheza, and I will be co-host and moderator for today's session. Today's session is the fourth session in the Fracture series, and we're particularly looking at the far right. Please feel free to participate in the chat. Feel free to participate in the Q&A. If you have questions specifically for our discussants, put them in the Q&A so that they can be captured up and brought into the attention of our speakers. And feel free to share links and resources because we want to all be in the same room and share all the knowledge that we can gather together that helps us to push back against this fascist surge that we are seeing. So, as I said, my name is Shaun Macheza, and I will be co-hosting. My co-host together is Maie Babker, who is a knowledge-building core strategist at Noor. Noor is our organizing partner for today's webinar, and they're a feminist and think and do tank devoted to building the power of gender justice and progressive movements to obstruct the far-right agendas and advance transformative alternatives. And No Strategic Knowledge Building Unit, which Maie works with, aims to engage with fascisms and fundamentalisms through a global South feminist lens. So this is going to be our session today. We've asked the speakers to please speak slow so that everyone can understand. If you're in the audience and you're having trouble following the speakers, please use the show captions button, as it really helps to follow with the transcript and gives you a chance to follow the conversation. Please feel free to share links in the chat, as I said. So we want to first get like really a feel for how the audience is interacting with today's topic. Like we said, we're talking about far right influence, and Maie is going to give a bit of an introduction, a bit more about that theme. But we just wanted to hear from you, the people in our audience. What do you think should be the left's top priority in countering far right influence? We all see the far right is on the surge. It's maybe has already surged. So what should we do in countering that far right influence? Should we strengthen education and media literacy? Is that the key way to go about this? Is it about building inclusive economic policies that address inequality? Is that the left's path? Should it be about seeking regulation of social media platforms more effectively? Are they the cause for what we're seeing? Or is it about creating a stronger, more unified, progressive political message? Is that what we're failing to do as the left? And perhaps it's none of the above. If there's something that you think should be a top priority for the left in countering far-right influence, please type it in the chat, because we're going to capture all this collective intelligence and really make sure that in the after email for this session, we share all that information with everyone who's participated and registered. So the poll is going to give us a bit of an understanding of how the room feels about our topic today. But I'm just going to hand over now to Maie, who's going to really give us a bit of an understanding of today's theme and is going to take us on to our first speaker. Maie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shaun, for the amazing introduction. I love the introduction. And also, thank you, everyone, for voting. It's not an easy choosing just one, but also interested reaction. We're interested in also none of the above. If you can share with us why and why not, and also more of your own insight based on your experience and work, not only to collect them, but to inform our conversation today. So that's a really, really interesting one. So let me start. Thank you, everyone. We are happy to be joining T and I and the wonderful speaker and all of you here today, comrades. This teach-in is not a lecture. It's a collective space, and we need your presence, your thinking, and your passion. The far right is not some looming threat. It's already here in law, culture, and media. Enforced through policy, sorry guys, my English, disguised as tradition and justified in the name of security. And while it might wear different faces from Riyadh to London, from Kampala to New Delhi, from Washington to San Salvador, it shares a single logic. That power belongs to the few and fear must govern the rest. This is not new. For many, the far right has never left. For others, it returns feels sudden, violent, and disorienting. But let's be clear, this is not just a backlash, but rather a culmination of organized global project and its winning ground, not just through force, but through myth-making, where they rely on narrative of purity to reshape how the people see the world and blamed for their own suffering. Today, we are here to break that illusion, to understand how this movement operates, how it captures anti-elite anger while protecting the powerful, how it weaponize misinformation, infiltrate the institution, and adapt faster, unfortunately, than we have been able to resist. We will be hearing from speakers who will trace the far-right political and economic project, its international alliances, and its deep entanglement with patriarchy, racism, and authoritarianism. But this space is not just about analysis, it's about resistance. Resistance is already happening in protest, in organizing, and in refusal. And we know outrage is not enough. We need strategy, we need memory, and we need each other. Now, without any further delay, let me start by introducing our first speaker, Ailynn Torres Santana. She is a professor, sorry guys, she is professor and researcher in the Department of Sociology and Gender Studies at the FLACSO in Ecuador, and associate researcher with the International Research Group on Authoritarian and Counter Strategy. Her research focuses on the intersection between state transformation, gender politics, and feminist movement, the political economy of paid and unpaid care work, and intersectional inequalities, and the rise of anti-gender politics and religious neoconservatism. So I'm going to start with our first question today, and it's for the speaker, and also if the audience would like to engage, please go ahead. So Ailynn, the far right is on the rise today. Let's unpack what we mean by this in the context of Latin America and the Caribbean. What interweaving ideologies and actors and structure have you observed within your work and within your context? So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maie. First of all, I want to say how deeply grateful I am for the invitation to take part in this Transnational Institute series. It's truly a pleasure to be part of this conversation, and I want to thank the entire team who coordinated, and of course, all of you who have joined us for this session. Now, moving to the questions, I'd like to begin with a key observation for Latin American standpoint. That is that the region is marked by deep political diversity today. I mean, by a remarkable heterogeneity of political processes and leadership. The beginning of the century was marked by a political cycle that was shaped by what has commonly referred to as the pink tide. I mean, a wave of governments generally considered progressive, but the pink tide began to recede with Mauricio Macri's electoral victory in Argentina in 2015. Actually, his political project represented a shift toward an anti-progressive, anti-populist project that ushered in a broader neoliberal realignment. At the moment, began a broader shift to the right, sometimes involving the continuation of right-wing rule, unfolded through various means. I mean, we can observe electoral victories as in Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, El Salvador, Chile, Uruguay, and Ecuador. But we can also take into account legislative action, as with the no vote to the peace accords in Colombia's referendum. And we also have to take into account state states coups and parliamentary coups in countries like Honduras, Bolivia, also in Brazil and Paraguay. And even we can observe a kind of internal transition within the pink tie government, like what happened with Lenin Moreno in Ecuador. But soon this scenario became more complex because in 2018, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, a left-wing candidate, was elected president in Mexico. In Bolivia, the movements for socialism returned to power. In Argentina, Alberto Fernandez won the elections. We can also see what happened in Peru with Pedro Castillo. Gabriel Boric was elected in Chile, and in Colombia, Gustavo Petro and Francia Márquez, as you probably know, also won the elections in Colombia. So what I want to place is that the region has entered in a phase of greater heterogeneity. However, there is no clear sign of a new progressive majority. Of course, that's precisely why it's so important to analyze the rise of the far right. And in fact, what we are witnessing in some cases is not just a rise, but a consolidation of far right forces. In the region, democratic backsliding driven by the far right forces that gain power through electoral means has advanced steadily. The victories of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil in 2018, Nayib Bukele in Salvador in 2019 and 2023, and Javier Milei in Argentina in 2023. There are examples of these processes. And in other countries, far-right movements have come close to winning elections in the past decades or hold significant influence within institutional frameworks and political negotiations. Unpacking its presence is not easy because there are different declinations in different countries. Some of these contemporary right-wing forces presented themselves as defenders of representative democracy and as respectful of institutional frameworks, at least to a certain extent. But at the same time, they promote heavy-handed policies that promise to restore order. And that's a very key point in this sense, because their authoritarian tendencies, which are not new, of course, have intensified and taken different forms and scales. We see this in despotic, paramilitary, and corrupt forms of governance, often justified throughout what we might call preventive discipline. You know, there is an intensification of violence that is deployed from within the state apparatus and authorized outside of it. We also need to talk about their neoliberal transversality in the sense that Wendy Brown has described it for the United States. I mean a valorization of unregulated markets in every domain of life, a conception of human beings as human capital, a rejection of social justice and the common good as supposedly totalitarian ideas, the privatization of public goods, the erosion of welfare states, and the reduction of governments to a mere instrument of economic growth. Along these lines, and despite clear differences across national contexts, the far right in Latin America also shares several traits. I can mention their new type of anti-progressism, a reliance of conspiracy theories, the colonization of everyday life and the mercantilization of bodies and nature, the expansion of emergency power, militarization and securitization, as I just said. And there is also strong focus on fighting corruption, always, of course, attributed to previous progressive governments. Efforts to dismantle regional coordination institutions created by the pink tide while building new ones. And also we can think in their political repositioning involving closer ties with the US, China, Russia, and the Pacific in different sense in different countries. Now, the question you have raised pushes us to go beyond these institutional and electoral dynamics to how the far right is growing and consolidating power. And here it's important to recognize that this isn't just a top-down process, because actually the rise of the far right is also happening from below through the grassroots actions of social actors who are building power in everyday spaces. So asking where and how the far right political forces are being reproduced is absolutely critical. And finally, we also need to look at the actors who are consolidating these right-wing projects and in that line and committed to thinking in terms of ecosystems, and specifically in terms of reactionary ecosystems that brings together religious actors, business chambers representing national oligarchies, and high-level political figures within state apparatus. And I related that to one last question. I mean, the place of the assemblages between the far right and neoconservatism. My argument there is that the far right political coalitions and the religious field are not only connected, but are sometimes openly overlapping. Religious leaders who enter the electoral arena or are part of legislative bodies or representatives of powerful economic forces, confessional parties gaining strength in the political sphere, and so on. And it's very important because in the region, far-right forces have a clear national conservative agenda. They are fueled by a powerful conservative imagination that updates and expands on democratic traditional values. And this worldwide aligns closely with the far-right religious neoconservatives. So the interaction between far-right forces and neoconservative religious actors has forged a solid and complex reactionary ecosystem composed of diverse actors operating across multiple scales to produce intricate political configurations. And that's important too, because we know that there are specific issues on which the far right bases its program and agenda: migration, security, climate change, and gender and sexuality politics. All of them, with different declinations, stand out as the primary arenas for far-right discourse and politicizations, each manifesting differently depending on the context. And regarding the issues of gender ideology, which I have studied in depth, the interconnections between the far right and neoconservatives are fundamental to unpacking the operation of the far right. So I just...
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ailynn. Lots to take from what you just shared. I mean, in particular, how I like how you've shown how there's different manifestations in different countries, but they all kind of feed into what do you call it, a reactionary ecosystem, so to speak, that's working together even across transnational borders. And I like in particular your last point where you spoke about the link between the far right and religious neoconservatism. And one might be led to think this is just with the Christian right, but what we've seen is it's not necessarily a Christian issue, but you even have sort of like other religions. For instance, for our next speaker, Raqib Hameed Naik, who's from India, we've seen sort of like a Hindu nationalist sort of a version of the far right. So speaking of which, I'll just introduce Raqib and ask him to give us a bit of that perspective from the Indian side of things. So Raqib is the founder and executive director of the Center for the Study of Organized Hate, a non-profit, non-partisan think tank that's based in Washington, D.C. He previously founded the hate tracker Hindutva.org, a real-time data set of human rights abuses, and India Hate Lab, which studies hate speech targeting India's religious minorities in the digital and offline realms. So maybe to already link to that, Raqib, um, Ailynn already spoke about some of the tactics deployed by the far right. Can you share how these movements today use propaganda and how they engage in digital fascism to increase their power?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and I'm truly honored to be here, to be part of this event, especially because of TNI's founder, Iqbal Ahmed, whose work has had a very profound influence on my understanding of politics, imperialism, and resistance. Um, and and there's definitely a lot that I can say about this, and some of it has already been covered by the previous speaker. But we need to know that the far right is on its expansionist phase, and it is more organized, more connected, more resourced, more powerful, and multiracial. With these strategic alliances that we are witnessing right among all these far right groups around the world. And it is a question that I often find myself grappling with, that are we living in an era where far right is the mainstream and we are on the fringes, or are we just kind of, rapidly heading in that direction? Um, so when it comes to propaganda and digital fascism, it emerges in multiple shapes and forms. And they are now very adept at leveraging these digital spaces, building these expansive digital ecosystems to exchange tactics, techniques, and procedures called TTPs. And uh, I mean, we are now living in a time where a far-right group, a leader somewhere in, for example, Myanmar, Nepal, India, or Sri Lanka, is more connected to far-right groups in the global north than ever before, exchanging these TTPs almost on daily basis because of the social media. And these alliances are very strategic in nature because, as I mentioned earlier, the far right is multiracial now. It's not just the Christian nationalists, but it's a multiracial space now. And it is not as if they agree on everything. Instead, these alliances are very much based on common enemies and common issues. For example, the alliance between Hindu far right and the alt-right in the US focuses on Muslims as their common enemy. But when the issue of immigration pops up, the Hindu far right supporters also find themselves at the receiving end of the alt-right hate here. So in terms of the tactics deployed, it's a multi-pronged approach that they have taken and built. That includes outright disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, and deploying seemingly innocuous ways to normalize extremist ideas. And I think popular culture is one of the most critical avenues where these actors have infiltrated over time through memes, viral videos, trending hashtags, and now more so with this AI generated content or synthetic media. And they're also very strategically uh, using live streaming and podcasting that we have seen over the many years build into a concrete force to have this very intimate relationship with the followers to subtly deliver extremist messaging. And I think and as we know, they discuss kind of a wide range of issues, topics that some of us really care about, and it kind of makes it very difficult for ordinary people to kind of differentiate between that everyday conversation and the far right propaganda. And apart from this live streaming and podcasting, there is also this new component of extremist music. This has been in existence and for a long time, but more so now. It has become a very potent weapon for building this communal identity among this very isolated and vulnerable youth. And in the Indian context, for example, they have come up with this new genre of music called Hindutva pop, Hindu nationalist pop, which has become a very powerful weapon for inciting violence. And these tactics, however, will just represent a fraction of the methods that they have been using. They're using to build and consolidate and expand power. But the far right is not just merely exploiting these existing digital platforms or using propaganda in a very traditional sense. They're also actually constructing their own powerful digital ecosystems from websites, from these messaging channels, encrypted spaces, and in some cases, they have taken control of previously mainstream spaces to further their agenda. I mean, Twitter, now X, is a very prime example. It's takeover by Musk. And under his leadership, the platform has descended into a cesspool of hate, high velocity disinformation, and conspiracy theories, which in my career I haven't seen anywhere else. Like I've seen these, marginal, small websites, far right websites, where these conversations happen, but to a scale, to a volume that we see on X nowadays, I haven't seen it before. So, um, and X has literally become a platform of the far right, for the far right and by the far right. And it is playing a very, very critical role in the global far right movement today. And this is something hopefully I'll talk about later, some of this with some of the examples, and hopefully I'll share the report as well that we did recently on how Musk, X, and this global network of far right converged on X in January to transform this so-called grooming gangs narrative in the UK to peddle Islamophobia and racism. So, and a lot of this content that we see on these platforms target the most vulnerable and marginalized people within our community. And the idea is to undermine trust in the democratic institutions and processes. And as I mentioned earlier, the troubling part is how these powerful individuals with a lot of money, the rich of the richest, are playing a very central role in this entire ecosystem. And they have kind of, very strategically weaponized the language of human rights, the free speech and democracy to further the far right agenda. And this is something that bothers me quite a lot because these are the very same people in one country, they will peddle this idea of free speech absolutism, and then in the other country, cobble with these authoritarian regimes to censor free speech. And this dynamic is, kind of, pretty dangerous. This convergence where these powerful business interests are actually aligning with the far right to further their mutual interests. It's a very dangerous new trajectory that we are witnessing in the far right space right now. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Raqib. And thank you to everyone in the chat. We can see it turning to a site of a deep discussion, questions, and also collective organizing and thinking. So thank you everyone for that. Keep it up. I'm just literally, I was looking at the chat and hearing it, and it's really extremely beautiful. So Raqib, and here we have the Global South far right groups are connected with the groups within the Global North now more than ever, because it's multiracial now, as you mentioned. They build enemy-based alliances, and in our everyday, in the media we consume and in the narrative we use. So this is one of the things that we are coming up against over and over and over again, as if we're trying to hit a wall with the how. Why, what is the appeal, and what is happening here? So without taking over the conversation, I'm gonna move it to the next speaker. Joe Mulhall is a historian, journalist, and writer. He's a director of, so sorry guys, of research at the UK largest anti-fascist organization, Hope Not Hate, where he has published a wide array of internationally recognized reports. He has published a series of books focusing on histories, politics, and music, including British fascism after the Holocaust, and co-authored the International Alt-Right Fascism for the 20th Century in 2021. He published Drum in the Distance, A Journey in the Global Far Right with Icon Books. So Joe, I'm just going to throw a question, and please feel free whether to pick up from the chat or within the points from the previous speaker. is based on your experience. Can you speak on your experience from infiltrating the far right, and how has it deepened your understanding of how the far right movement weaponized anti-migrant, racist narrative, and other narratives as well, like the great replacement theory, to pull people in? So our question is the appeal, basically. So thank you, Joe, and I'll move to the background.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for having me. I was buzzing to get the invite actually, and to see so many people from all over the world on here. I mean, we often talk about, understandably, the far right in our own national context because they're the people we're seeing on our streets, in our communities, down our roads, in our parliaments. But which means that we need to act hyper locally. But I think, as has been said by both previous speakers, this is a genuinely transnational threat now. So we have to conceptualize the threat globally, even if we continue to act hyper locally. So yeah, it's great to be here. So broadly speaking, so I work for an organization called Hope Not Hate. We're an anti-fascist organization, and we combine kind of open source research and on the ground campaigning. But one of our elements of work is infiltration, and part of that reason is that the far right lie, put quite bluntly. So it's almost like when you take out a camera, some people, people smile. If you just do normal, in some senses, research on the far right, sometimes you don't get to the truth. And as a campaign organization, we want to get behind the story and inside the groups to understand what it is they're planning, who it is they're targeting, etc., so that we can kind of develop better counter strategies. And the two big questions that my job ended up being, for about 8-9 years or so, my job was joining far right groups around the world for Hope Not Hate, originally in the UK, in kind of anti-Muslim street movements, and then kind of more extreme kind of fascist think tank groups, and then a bit of time in Europe in the alt-right groups, and then eventually in America in the run-up to the Trump election, where I kind of spent some time in the KKK and then a militia group in Alabama I lived with for a while. And the big two questions I always get asked is, who are these people and what do they believe? So I thought I'd very briefly try and touch upon them. And in terms of who they are, this is going to be an unsatisfactory answer, but I often go back to this story of when I was in this militia group in Alabama. It was the run-up to the Trump election, the first time round. And it was this very extreme far-right militia group based in Alabama whose job it was to go out to the Mexican border, dressed in all their guns like soldiers, and attempt to stop undocumented migrants coming across. Or in there, as they thought, to stop ISIS coming across. And it won't surprise you to realize there wasn't a vast amount of ISIS coming across the Mexican border at the time, but that didn't stop them from believing that to be the case. But one of the things that shocked me most about it, they were run by this guy called Cornbread. I know it sounds like I'm making these American names up, but he was called Cornbread. And I remember he kind of walked over to me, and I ended up staying with them in where they lived in extremely poor areas of Alabama, often in trailer parks, with, in one case, with no running water. And I kind of spent some time in the desert with them and their houses. And understandably, as a white passing man, they were extraordinarily kind to me, right? All of those stories you hear about Southern hospitality and all those things were true. In their eyes, I was a white Englishman who agreed with their politics and so had come over to help them for a period. But they were extraordinarily nice people. And I caveat this in a second. When I lived with them, they were kind, they were friendly, they were, and they had a world which in many ways was very small. They'd never met many of these guys from outside Alabama, let's say outside of America. And then I remember we were in the desert on this horrifying mission in terms of its extremeness, and we ran out of some petrol, so we drove the 40 miles or whatever it was, the nearest petrol station or gas station. And I love American sweets because I'm quite chubby, and I was sat there picking away sweets at in the aisles, the counters and stuff, and this one guy called Bama, out of the blue, had been the sweetest man you've ever met, just leant over and goes, "By the way, when the race war starts, I've got this list of mosques that I'm going to wipe out." And it just kind of came out the blue like this, right? And the reason I tell that story is, I think, because I find it deeply unsettling. When people say, who are the far right? And when we talk about these vast global networks, people are as different as you can imagine in the sense of all these different countries. But I sometimes think progressive movements in the left, we find comfort in the idea of thinking of the far right as people that are not like us. They're over there somewhere. We talk about them like they're monsters, like they're reptilian, and I think we take comfort in that, because I think it's actually much more scary to think that the far right people, in many cases, not hugely dissimilar to ourselves in some ways. And I say that in a global far right networks, when we're talking about a multiracial far right as well, it's not merely skinhead white men in kind of dressed as skinheads with swastika tattoos, although they of course do exist. The far right attracts people from all now walks of life, and most importantly, these are people that are in our workplaces. They are in our trade unions, even. They are in our they live on our estates. They go on our public transport, etc. And so I like to vanquish the idea that the far right is this kind of thing that you could spot on the streets. Of course, the reason that the far right is rising all over the world over the last 30 years, especially to the point where, as has been mentioned, we had this triptych at the world top of global power with Trump, Bolsonaro, Modi. We also had Orban in Hungary, and then each exception to the rule, as the literature would talk about, whether or not that was Germany was going to be the exception because of its Nazi history. We now have the AfD on 30%. The Iberian Peninsula would be the exception because these were these new democracies post Salazar and Franco. Sweden would be the exception because of its liberal history. Each of these, of course, now has far-right parties either in government or in parliamentary chambers, etc. The energy and the optimism is within the far right in large chunks of the world, unfortunately, not just rather than with the progressive sector and the progressive movements. And part of that is because lots of people are supporting the far right. And so we have to kind of vanquish any sense that fascists and Nazis are just these monsters that we can spot on the street. We're now talking about much more fundamentally large movements that are rooted in our political systems. So the second thing, just to finish off on that, is, so what do they believe? Now, of course, this is extremely trying to explain why similar things are happening in so many different countries and continents is extremely difficult. The differences between each country are, of course, as numerous as the similarities between them. There's no monocausal explanation for what we're witnessing. Each country has its own drivers and etc. But I do think there is a few things we can point to when we want to understand why so many people are being attracted to the far right. And this comes through from when you speak to them, when you monitor them, and when you disrupt them. Despite all these things. One of them, of course, is I think it's already been mentioned, is when it comes to things like globalization, it increasingly looks like transnational economic integration is simultaneously contributing to a kind of domestic disintegration, with these ever-growing divides between those that are winning out through the systems and those that are either losing from the system or have a perceived sense of loss through the system. I think it's also super important. Many of these groups, and not all, of course, but many of these individuals and groups seem to suggest there is a correlation between economic pessimism, or what sometimes gets called declinism, and these illiberal and extreme views. None of this is designed to excuse far-right fascist politics in any way whatsoever, but in terms of understanding strategies and how we understand them and fight back, we have to understand what's motivating them. And increasingly it looks like the more pessimistic people are about both their current positions and their future, the more likely they are to be susceptible to politics that opposes things like immigration and multiculturalism, the more susceptible they are to accept the idea of autocratic and anti-democratic solutions. Put simply, I think the biggest learning from spending years with these people whose politics I abhorred and campaigning against them and writing about them since is the far right in many ways is on the rise because people don't believe the status quo is working for them. Right? Liberal democracy, social democratic political parties, they're not providing the material, they're not making the material lives of people that they govern better. And it's very difficult to ask people to stick with political parties, political systems, economic systems, social systems that either are not improving their lives and, of course, in many cases have made them actively worse. This creates this huge pool of people all over the world that are extremely susceptible to far-right politics. You throw in, things like the internet, etc., which I can kind of come onto when I speak later again. You end up with this huge pool of individuals that are susceptible to be preyed upon by far-right politicians and parties. They prey on individuals' anger and they play on their fear. And although this is a very sweeping statement, until we can find a way to make people less angry and less scared, I think the far right will continue to do well. So that's just a kind of broad overview trying to answer those two questions.
Awesome, great. Thank you so much, Joe. Quite a lot to digest there, and I have to say your perspective really kind of like puts gives a deeper understanding, I think, of why this phenomenon is showing up in so many different parts of the world, right? That should be so different, but at the same time, it's manifesting in this very similar way. And I think your point about globally people feeling like the status quo is not working for them, and then having sort of like political predators, so to speak, capitalizing on that sentiment. That seems to track. That's really how it feels, because from what we've heard about what's happening in Latin America, and what we've heard about what's happening in India, and now from your work where you've looked in sort of global north context in the UK and America where you've worked, it's a very similar sentiment. Things are not working for me, somebody's to blame, and somebody points a finger, and sort of this dynamic gets kicked into play. Quite interesting. Very great insights from all our speakers. I'd just like to remind the audience that you can still ask questions to the panelists in the chat. I see people asking questions to each other and answering and responding. That's really great. But if you put questions in the Q&A, we can kind of sweep them up and ask them to the panelists. But that will be in the next round. Now let's go to a second round of questions. Let's think about kind of like a deeper understanding, maybe also looking at tactics and strategies that might be helpful for the left. I'd like to invite our speakers to think in those terms. Perhaps Ailynn, from your work, what are the key shared narratives and themes that you've seen for the political analysis of neoliberal authoritarianism and religious conservatism? You'd already started speaking about that a bit in your first intervention, and how do these adapt to the national context from the work that you've done yourself?
First, I want to remark something Raqib said before, because I think it's very important to me. I think we need to abandon the idea of a backlash as an analytical resource for thinking about the far right. We need to think about its intrinsically productive dimension, about what they create: platforms, networks, campaigns, agendas. They don't just react. And the idea that it's a backlash is, at this point, maybe misleading. And, and just, I was thinking about that when Raqib was talking. So regarding the last questions, as I mentioned earlier, I see the relationship between the far right and religious neoconservatives as key to understanding the far right politics. That's not mean that the relationship between the left and religious neoconservatism doesn't need to be considered. In fact, I think it's absolutely vital to understanding the bigger picture for understanding the bigger picture and building resistance. Now, however, I'm going to focus on the relationship between the far right and religious neoconservatism. And in that sense, broadly speaking, there are several lines of continuity that shape the assemblages producing the reactionary anti-feminism ecosystem we see in far right politics. We can point to their shared anti-progressism and anti-communism. We can also point to their common use of so-called anti-colonialism as a political argument. For example, both religious neoconservatism and the far right have claimed that the gender agenda is out of step with national values and represents an attempt by foreign powers to recolonize their nations. We also see common arguments about insecurity, violence, and war. And we can trace a fundamental line of thinking around their references to freedom, both in terms of the content and the way that freedom is packaged and presented. But I believe that what really strengthens these assemblages between religious neoconservatism and the far right is the fight against so-called gender ideology. And that's why I want to spend a little more time at this point. My argument here is that the politics against gender ideology must be understood as a transnational formation, one shaped by the far right and by religious neoconservatism. And this has several important implications. First, it reminds us that attacks on gender ideology happening in each country are not isolate events. They are part of a broader interconnected phenomenon. At the same time, a transnational perspective shouldn't lead us to overlook the significance of national and local contexts, of course, where many key dimensions of anti-gender politics take shape. In fact, the transnational view helps highlight the tensions and connections between local processes and regional or global trends. What I want to emphasize is that unlike other central issues often associated with the far right, such as migration, as I mentioned, climate change, or security, it's the discourse around gender ideology that most clearly brings far-right movements and religious neoconservatism together. And that alliance is strategically essential for far-right politics. Along those same lines, I think that the fight against gender ideology provides the moral foundation of the far-right agenda. And this goes far beyond simply trying to regulate gender and sexuality. In fact, I would say that the religious moralization of gender and sexuality enables far-right movements to be politically incorrect exactly in those areas where women's and LGBTQ rights have been recognized as human rights. This allows far-right forces to openly challenge, or in some cases directly deny or redefine the human rights framework itself. Now, if we look more closely at the role that gender ideology plays in the alliance between the far right and religious neoconservatism, we can see something that I think it's very important. While the idea of gender ideology often comes from religious circles, its politicization happens through two key and different processes. One is the secularization of religious discourse, and the other is the re-sacralization of politics. The secularization of the discourse around gender ideology has been widely analyzed. Many scholars have noted that this framework has helped create common ground for groups from different ideological traditions, religious backgrounds, and political positions. We all know that. Through this process, the idea of gender ideology has been adopted not only by faith-based actors, but also by secular figures and political leaders. And as that happened, the term gained a broader range of definitions and meanings. And at the same time, the fight against gender ideology has become intrinsically central to the far-right agenda. It has gained visibility, structure, and weight over time. Some scholars have argued that denouncing gender ideology is a key element that unites different far-right forces and helps form what they describe as a kind of right-wing intersectionality. So within far-right politics, we find a variety of arguments used to attack gender ideology. One claims that gender policies have expanded the role of the state, imposed the moral beliefs of a minority, interfered in the people's private life, and restricted individual freedom, for example. Another suggests that gender ideology is a tool used by corrupt elites in governments to divert public resources. And a third kind of argument presents gender ideology as a Trojan horse for international organizations that want to erode national sovereignty and push a so-called globalist agenda. And I just want to finish this idea. I think that the far right, the fight against gender ideology is framed as a defense of a natural order, one that supposedly preserves human life, reflects scientific truth, and so on. And for doing that, the far-right forces have re-sacralized the political sphere. In fact, the fight against gender ideology has become a tool to moralize politics itself. they make what Veronica Gago calls a moralizing use of references to God, heteronormative sexuality, and the traditional family. And when you analyze the different political far-right forces in Latin America and globally, the presence of God is much more central now than it was in the past. So these two processes, secularization and pre-sacralization, are not contradictory. They actually complement one another and work toward the same political goal. But finally, it is important to remark that the relation between far-right forces and religious neoconservatism is not just a question, a matter of convergence, because there are also contradictions between far-right forces and religious neoconservatism, and we need to analyze those contradictions. I can go in deep at this point later.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ailynn. I definitely see trends from what you're speaking about. It's not only in Latin America, right? It's like I'm looking at context where I'm looking at Zimbabwe, for instance, where I'm from, and a whole lot of the African social media space, where you have indeed this dynamic that you're describing, where the politics becomes more moralistic, and at the same time, the conversation around gender roles and sex becomes heavily secularized and kind of changes in terms of the dynamic that you see there. This is sort of a sign, I think, of the influence you see across the transnational lines, where you have a far right coordination and sort of different manifestations of similar ideas in different cultural, religious, and political contexts. I'd like to follow that thread, maybe to just quickly ask Raqib, how are far-right movements like Hindutva, for instance, forging alliances with actors in the global north? And what systems of funding, ideology, or soft power make these transnational ties possible? Because we're seeing the influence, aren't we?
Right. No, thank you for that question. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, these alliances are highly strategic. But to go a little back, this appeal of Hindu nationalism among the Christian right as an ideology, is it new? I'm sure many of you here must know about the white supremacist neo-Nazi terrorist Anders Breivik, who killed 77 people in 2011 in Norway. And he wrote this big manifesto running in thousands of pages, in which he praised Hindu nationalist movement as an ideology and as a key ally in the struggle to bring down democracies around the world. And the ironic part, Hindu nationalism as an ideology and Hindu nationalists in India are both persecuting Muslims and Christians. There's this Hindu nationalist leader, very towering figure named M.S. Golwalkar. He was the second chief of Rashtra Swayamsevak Sangh, or the RSS. It's a paramilitary fascist group and the ideological parent of Prime Minister Modi's party, the BJP. He wrote this book in 1966. It's called Bunch of Thoughts, and in which he has a chapter dedicated to internal enemies. And in that chapter, he writes that Muslims and Christians are number one and number second enemies to the country, to India. And around the very same time this book was published, RSS members began immigrating to countries in global north, including the US, Canada, UK, and various European countries. And over the subsequent decades, what these members have done is they have established this replica of the RSS infrastructure in their host countries. For example, the RSS in India has a sister organization in the US. It's called HSS. In India, there's this militant Hindu nationalist group called Vishwa Hindu Parishad. It's involved in a lot of orchestrating a lot of incidents of violence targeting Muslims and Christians equally. It has a US counterpart right now. It's called Vishwa Hindu Parishad of America. And RSS has a service wing in India called Seva Bharati, a charity wing, so as to say. And it has a registered US wing called Seva International. And 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 these groups form the ideological and financial backbone of Hindu nationalism abroad, and of course also building these broader far-right alliances, and they are mobilizing under the banner of cultural preservation, religious freedoms, and charity, while actively promoting these bigoted narratives that are, fascist at its core, and advocating for Indian government's interests, especially the Modi government, and fundraising for a lot of these RSS affiliated organizations in India. And I think I also want to let people know here the scale of this financial support. The one group I mentioned earlier, Seva International, for example, it's based in the US, and it solely relies through grassroots donations. And according to its text documents, between 2015 and 2023, they raised $87 million through grassroots donations. $87 million. And this is just one of the organizations I'm talking about. In its network, just in the US, the Hindu Nationalist Network, there are hundreds of registered nonprofit charities and hundreds of family foundations they're running. And now imagine such infrastructure existing across 50 countries globally. It's RSS that says that it has HSS and this existing network in more than 50 countries, which means we're talking about billions of dollars that are being funneled into the Hindu nationalist movement back in India and globally. And and I must also kind of, dive a bit into these very strategic political and far-right landscape in the host countries where these organizations are based. For example, in the US, they have kind of, historically aligned with the Democrats, of course, because they're a minority people of color. But there has been a very noticeable shift recently towards supporting Republicans in the recent election, for example, which is also quite telling of the fact that how flexible they are in their political affiliations, which are kind of, very based on what serves their interests best. And they also have alliances with far-right groups, Islamophobes and Zionists, with Muslims positioned as common enemies. And as I mentioned during my earlier intervention about our report, Grooming Gangs report on X, it targeted Muslims in the UK. Like Muslims in the UK, come on, guys, what do you have to do? But you have this 10% of accounts within the data set we found from India peddling Islamophobia, targeting Muslims in there, and undermining the credibility of public institutions as if they are promoting, protecting Muslims for running these so-called rape gangs. And we're also observing this cross-pollination of these anti-minority far-right conspiracy theories. For example, there's this conspiracy theory called love jihad in India. It originated in India, which alleges Muslims of running a coordinated campaign, Muslim men, to seduce Hindu women and convert them to Islam. And it is gaining quite a lot of visibility within the white supremacist and Islamophobic networks globally. And to name a few Islamophobic provocators like Amy Mack and Robert Spencer in the US, Tommy Robinson in the UK, Gert Wilders in the Netherlands, they're increasingly utilizing this term to broadly target Muslims. And there's another trend that we are also witnessing quite often, and uh, is this, the Indian far-right influences frequently appearing on these Western far-right platforms and podcasts and shows, and it's a vice versa, both things. For example, Tommy Robinson, before going to jail, he appeared on one of the podcast shows of this Indian far-right website called Op India. So all of this points to a very troubling reality that Hindu nationalism, which just a decade ago was thought to be very localized, it's not confined to the borders of India. It has become a very, very globalized, networked movement with a lot of resources at its disposal, and which is embedded in this broader architecture of transnational far-right extremism. And its actors have also learned to speak this language of civil rights in liberal democracies, while advancing their fascist ideas that dehumanize minorities throughout. So I'll just stop there, and hopefully I'll look forward to the Q&A session to answer more of those questions.
Thank you, Raqib. And so we are moving right now to our, sorry guys, Shaun, can you take over? I have a bit of internet.
No problem at all, Maie. Thank you so much, Raqib. Great analysis there of how we're seeing sort of these transnational financial flows and transnational solidarity networks amongst the far right. Joe, you've studied the far right across different contexts, and despite them coming from sort of a nationalist rhetoric, what we're seeing from all the different contexts, these far right actors are learning from each other across borders. Maybe from the work that you've done, what tactics or narratives have you seen travel most effectively, and through which channels have you seen that happen?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, I can't give a better explanation of it than Raqib just gave there when he was talking about how some of these networks operate. And funny enough, I remember being in India a few years ago thinking, oh, we spend a lot of time looking at Tommy Robinson, this anti-Muslim activist in the UK who's getting out of prison tomorrow. And I thought, oh, I'm in India, I'll have a break, turn on the television. And the first thing I did is I saw all these BJP supporters on this news show talking about how great Tommy Robinson was, and I thought I can't escape him. But that unable to escape him thing is important actually. So this goes back to how do these networks operate? What are they? And I think this does go some way to explaining a little bit at least why it is we're seeing such similar things as has been mentioned in so many parts of the world. Now, I would caveat all of this by saying the far right has always been international, right? Both when it was fringe movements, etc., but also in power. It has always sought to collaborate across borders. We've also always had transnational far right and fascist networks, music scenes, Holocaust denial networks, conferences, etc. But I think obviously in the digital age things have begun to change. So I think there's two things I'll mention. One is how it is that national organizations are collaborating, and one is in the digital age these vast networks that now operate. And of course that question that you kind of mentioned there, how is it that political parties and activists that are ostensibly hyper or ultra nationalist, why is it they collaborate across borders, and how do they do it? And one of the ways they do it is exactly as kind of Raqib was mentioning there, is they conceptualize many of these threats internationally. They often create kind of conspiratorial supernatural enemies that they can collectively oppose. Traditionally, that may have been kind of conspiracy theories about Judeo-Bolshevist communism, etc. Increasingly these days, of course, it's Islam, but it's also transnational bodies like the EU or the UN or WHO, etc. This allows ultra-nationalist organizations to find common cause across borders by conceptualizing it as this kind of external threat, because say traditionally now is Islam both an internal and an external threat. This common worldview, of course, then means that they can internationally collaborate more easily. But what's really dangerous about the way that these national organizations collaborate is they are extremely willing to learn from each other when it comes to what works. Right? We saw this when we saw kind of various far right and fascist parties throughout the 90s, for example, modernizing their rhetoric, etc. They were looking at each other to see what happens to win. Each country then that ends up with a far right leader or a far right government ostensibly becomes a laboratory for both the electoral tactics that led to that victory, but also the policy ideas and implementation of them. If you think about Hungary, for example, now, and the way that the American Republican movement often talk about Orban and Hungary. And I think this confidence is key here, right? One of the things that far right politicians and parties and activists offer, they turn around and say, we're going to give you change, this mythical vision of a past or a mythical vision of this utopian future. One of the things that sounded particularly absurd to many people maybe 30 years ago, when these were tiny little groupuscules on the fringes of politics often. And when I say fringes of politics, I'm talking about organized far-right groups. I'm not talking about, of course, the vast structural issues within most certainly northern societies when it comes to, you know, colonialism, imperialism, etc. But these little groups that were pushing fascist and far-right politics, people would say, how are you going to change the world? You're tiny. That's obviously changed now because it no longer looks like a pipe dream. Much of the energy and enthusiasm is with these movements. And in a globalized world, the election of a far-right figure in one country can have reverberations around the globe. Victory in one place can spur on a victory in another, and it's creating this sense of epochal change, right? That it becomes self-realizing. And all of this is simultaneously contributing to the normalization and the mainstreaming of far-right politics, and that's accelerated through victories. How can this person be an extremist, as you say? They're sitting in the White House, or they're sitting, they're running countries around the world. All of this is undermining any sort of cordon sanitaire existed that kept extreme far-right politics on the margins of our society. So that here we have kind of national organizations collaborating. But I think super important now is it's not just national organizations or parties collaborating between countries. We also have these vast decentralized networks of far-right activists all over the world, what we call at Hope Not Hate, the post-organizational far-right. And by this, I mean these groups and individuals conceptualize their struggle transnationally, often in terms of either racial, cultural, historical boundaries, right? The internet has allowed for genuine transnational networks to emerge. They conceptualize their mission across borders. And these are thousands of individuals all over the world that offer micro donations of time, sometimes money, as has been mentioned, and they collaborate towards common political goals and often outside of any sort of formal organization or any structure. The movement lacks formalized leaders, but they have these figureheads, right? And they draw from this increasing, and they're often social media influencers. And so for much of the post-war period all over the world, to get active in this form of politics, you might have to go to a city, you might have to write to a book list, you might have to make a phone call, etc. Now, of course, you can sit anywhere in the world as long as you have an internet connection, and you can engage in far-right politics by watching content, creating content, networking on forums, speaking on voice chat services, spreading hate and networking across various mainstream social media platforms. And all of this can be done anonymously. Or increasingly semi-anonymously at least, which means that there's often very little social cost for these activists. So at Hope Not Hate, we can spend months and months picking and unpicking a far-right global network and find out it's being run by a 14-year-old kid in a bedroom in Lithuania, right? These movements are now understood, or should be understood, as a many-headed hydra, right? If you take away one leader, another one will emerge. And importantly, to finish, they genuinely conceptualize the threat in a transnational sense. While they're continually preoccupied with their country, their community, etc., they contextualize it internationally or globally. And by that, I mean, no longer is it just someone who's really angry about halal chicken nuggets being sold in a school in the north of England. They're then plugged into networks whereby they're seeing halal chicken nuggets in a school in Brazil or North America or Australia or South Africa or Israel or wherever it is in the world. And this creates this global sense of crisis in many of these cases. And these networks are, of course, very open to manipulation from all sorts of foreign governments. If you understand these networks, the best way to understand them is perhaps is like a school of fish, right? They move around the internet. They kind of coagulate around a particular issue, like grooming gangs has been mentioned, and then they dissipate again. I always remember Le Pen, the French far-right leader, when she thanked the online militants all over the world for their activism to help her in the last election. And there was an Australian far-right activist underneath saying, I thought I was just shitposting online. I didn't realize I was part of this global network. These networks now operate as synapses that sit in and around the national far-right political parties and organizations that are winning elections. And these synapses are through which the far-right shift money, tactics, iconography, ideology. They create the infrastructure around which the far right can act as a global phenomenon. So I guess just to conclude then, what I think this demands is that we have to change our thinking when it comes to anti-fascism or opposing fascist and far right politics, right? The internet is wonderful. All these are beautiful things it's allowed us to do. I remember fighting against European identitarian networks in the Mediterranean and being able to get in contact with Tunisian fishermen who were helping us. Like, it's all those wonderful things the internet can do. Through that interconnectivity can also produce new challenges, right? It can also produce the means by which far-right activists can traverse the globe with their ideas and their ideology and ostensibly best practice, right? So if we want to understand the danger that these movements face, we can't just look at our street, we can't just look at our community or even our country. We have to think in some cases even beyond political parties and formal organizations, and we have to think beyond national borders. As I kind of said at the very beginning, we have to work hyper-locally what's happening down our street, but I think these networks demand that we increasingly think globally. So I think that's hopefully shows a little bit of the role of those networks.
Thank you so much, Joe, and thank you so much for all of our speakers. But also, we are blown away by the chat, the discussion, the questions. Oh my God! And we're hoping that we can find time to, answer and go deep in many of them. However, many of our focus here will be about resistance. Ways that has been working and ways of expanding, looking at our tactics and strategies and beyond at this moment, based on everything that we're trying currently to absorb from all what the speakers are telling us. Feel free to go into the Q&A, answer some questions, but so I'm just gonna pick randomly because all of them are good. I'm not sure which one to start with, but we have a question here. Is the alt-right a useful term anymore? Hasn't the so-called alt-right became mainstream? And it's, not just alt-right, far-right and left and all of those questions. There's been a compilation of musings throughout the conversation. So any of the speaker, if you would like to jump in regarding definition and terminologies, that would be great.
I'm happy to jump in. Yeah. I mean, and people, this is a debate, right? So people might disagree with it. I understand the alt-right as it was a distinct far-right transnational movement that combined European, like nouvelle droite, kind of like new right ideology from the post-60s era with the American white supremacist movement and this kind of particular means by which far-right activists operated online through this kind of hostile form of activism. And that kind of collaboration between those three spheres created this far-right fascistic decentralized network. It had groups and organizations in it, but ostensibly it was a milieu around the world. Its roots can be traced back to 68 in France with the Nouvelle Droite and stuff, and the identitarian sort of early identitarians, but it kind of peaked through to 2000, 14, 15, 16, 17, etc. It's certainly as a coherent, mappable network as it was through that period, it's no longer that. Right, it's a much more decentralized, less coherent force. Very few of those individuals who were in those networks are not still operating in some sense, though. Right, the people are still there, and in some cases they ended up in the White House. But the network is less of a coherent thing where ostensibly they would talk about them. So I would go to identitarian and alt-right conferences in America and across Europe and the UK, and they talked about themselves as a coherent movement. You won't really find those individuals talking about themselves as saying, I'm a member of the alt-right anymore in the same way. But the politics that they have, as you rightly say, large chunks of what they talked about have entered mainstream discourse, and you can read them in our newspapers or you can hear them in our parliamentary chambers. And so in one sense, the fact they're decentralized is less important. And they certainly felt like they won, right? I remember in 2014 being at a National Policy Institute fascist conference in DC when Obama was in the White House, right? And they called it After the Fall. And I remember writing back this intelligence report to London going, you've got to be joking, right? These people are lunatics. They think that they're like liberal democracy is going to fall. And then like 4 years later, going to one in Stockholm and everyone there saying it was called Rising from the Ruins. And they were like, okay, liberal democracy is basically on its last knees. We're on the way up. They felt that it was a coherent movement that had a timeline and that they'd basically won, which I'm not sure is accurate, of course. But yeah, they all still exist, or most of them are still around, but I wouldn't call it a coherent alt-right movement. Makes much sense anymore. But others might disagree. People, that's a bit of a debate.
Thank you so much, Joe, and leaving space to Ailynn and Raqib to comment on that and pick up some of these points. Just unmute, guys. We're in.
Well, I think, I'm in agreement of what Joe mentioned here. So I think he has already answered the question.
Okay. Let's move to another one, and it's hard to choose as always. We had a point regarding basically, I'm just rephrasing here. What gives us the right? For, as people who is identifying as West or progressive, what give us the right regarding coding different opinion as far-right ideology? So based on that and based on our sheer audacity to resist far-right ideology, this question is for all the panelists, actually. If you can, from your perspective and location, what are some of the concrete signs of effective resistance and how can they be magnified? What new form of resistance are necessary, especially with a mental gymnasium regarding free speech, right, audacity, all of that?
Well, I think I can go first. Again, I mean, as far right is evolving and becoming a more potent force, the ways to counter it and push back are also evolving. Things that worked in the past aren't working anymore. As a lot of these other panelists, fellow panelists also mentioned that we're not just, facing a challenge that is small in magnitude. It's very powerful. Like there are rich people, the richest person in the world right now is one of them. So they have all the resources they need, and on the other side, it's just us, who are under-resourced, you know. So I think there are multiple ways. For example, in our case, and by the way, that goes to my early introduction. I'm a Kashmiri. I'm from the administered side of Indian administered side of Kashmir, not Indian. So, and in 2020, I was forced to leave Kashmir to move into self-exile. And from self-exile, this is a challenge because every day you see so much happening on the ground. What is it that you do? So for me, the first step for resistance from so far away was documentation. I started documenting hate crimes, hate speeches, and built this entire repository that government couldn't take down. So if I was in India, for example, they would have, picked me up, locked me in, and then all of this would have, gone away. But what I did was I started documenting, and I think documentation could, for me, especially, was the first act of resistance. So documentation, more and more documentation, more education and awareness, like some of these networked transnational alliances that we spoke about today. I'm pretty sure a lot of people might not even know what Hindu nationalism is. So we really need to go back to the grassroots, to our people, and tell them what's really unfolding in front of our world and where we are actually headed to, the dangerous territory in coming years. And I wouldn't even say decades, just coming years. Next 4 to 5 years, the way we see world right now, it will be a totally different place. So how it should unfold or how it should be like, it's up to us. What is it that we're going to do to stop that from happening? And I think we also need to build, because a lot of these conversations that we had here were about how do we protect our communities. And I think that and stop people from believing in these extremist ideas and ideologies. And I think we must start working towards building resilience in our communities, because the, our community is exposed to this ever increasing presence of far right in both our real and virtual lives. And the scale at which the far right is exposing our communities to harm, it's literally a public health crisis right now, I would say. And for public health crisis, it requires comprehensive strategies that engage entire communities rather than just some certain pockets. And I think we need proactive and collective measures to create protective frameworks that would shield our communities from this exposure to far-right extremism, propaganda, and hate, while also mitigating its various manifestations, because that is something I slightly mentioned. This hate, these conspiracy theories, this has real world impact on the target communities, and it manifests into violence. So we really had to work on mitigating that. And I think if the far right can form strategic alliances across these ideological and national boundaries, why can't we? If they can identify shared interests and mobilize collectively, I think we can do so as well. And I think that brings here this idea to forge these robust, inclusive coalitions like, the one we saw today that came together to put this event together. And I think these coalitions can also play a very big role in strengthening these pockets of the pockets of resistance against far right across borders and continents. I'll just stop there.
Okay,
And
thank you so
in the
Hameed?
same, yeah, in the same line, I think that there are two things I consider key. First, I think that we have to reclaim the framework of human rights. I think there is a field of politicization that the left must conquer. And I also think the left needs to be more consistent in reclaiming the discourse on freedom. Freedom is a fundamental cornerstone of the far right, and they have turned the fight for freedom into a fight against equality, and the left needs to turn that equation around. I think that that's very important. And in terms of resistance, I think grassroots and popular feminism are doing a lot in Latin America to resist the far right, and there is a source of inspiration there. But above all, I think we need to connect our struggles today more than ever. Feminism, feminist, anti-racist, territorial defense, etc. And we must do so in political, analytical, and also in analytical terms. In a recent column by Judith Butler regarding Trump's policies, I remember she stated that it's key to discern the connection between the different proclamations and politics. And she also stated that it's a moment to understand the fascist passions that fuel this blatant drive for authoritarian power. And I think that it's very powerful idea. The advancement of far-right policies must be comprehended holistically. And this requires discerning the specificity of each front they open, recognizing also the organic connection between them, and investigating how these assemblages are reproduced in the social arena, daily life, social and political attitudes. And I think that that's very important for resistance to analyze and politicize the holistic panorama that far right is producing, and also that we have to produce as within the left field.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I agree with everything that both of them said. There was a few things that I just noted down thinking about kind of resistance. One, I think, is things like this, transnational collaboration, and I think that's super important, especially around documentation, as Raqib mentioned. Understanding what it is that's happening, even if it's just letting each other know when people are crossing borders. They seem to be very keen on borders. So when we've got far-right activists moving from one country to the other or collaborating, I think that as well, and documenting it. Democratic empowerment, I think, is super important, right? I think at like hyper-local levels as well, even right into tower blocks and housing estates, etc. The far-right are very good at preying on the powerless. And part of the reason is because lots of people don't have power. So finding ways to change our democratic institutions and our ways to empower people collectively. I always remember there was a tower block in East London that voted for the much more extreme far-right party called the British National Party. And we spent months knocking on doors, getting them together for a barbecue because they didn't know their neighbours, getting the local councillors, getting the local MP there, and they could hold that MP to account. So when the BNP knocked on the doors at the next election and said, no one ever listens to you, they said, well, actually, I spoke to my MP last week. And we're getting some changes. So that like empowering people at a local level, exposing fault lines. Many of the far right parties that we look at, I think there's huge fault lines between what they claim they're going to do for people in communities and the reality of them, and widening those seems really obvious, and it's a vast thing to say, but economic justice in a broad sense. But I think, again, all of these things in some ways are about taking away the tools of the far right. I completely agree with what was mentioned by Ailynn about kind of intersectional struggles, understanding how it is a commonality both across borders and within and between communities, and I would also throw class in there as an important one as well. Holding on to space. In lots of places, it feels like we're increasingly on the back foot. It's not where we're going to win next. It's about how do we hold on to the things, and that's a sad realization. But sometimes holding on to those spaces that we have now, whether or not that's through our youth centres, through our activist spaces, etc., I think are really important. In terms of one of the most effective tactics, I think culture, right? One of the things that the far right have been really good at globally is understanding that in some ways politics is downstream as culture. Traditionally people would have talked about it from a Gramscian sense, and now they talk about it as a far right sense. I think understanding the power of culture, both within our communities and across our borders, I think is super important. And the most important thing I think here is, and I say this as someone sitting in Britain where we've just had dreadful elections and we're living in the wake of Brexit and all those things. I think we need better stories. I think we need a better vision of change. What does the world look like, or what should it look like, and what are we fighting for? One of the things the far right are very good at is they often this mythical vision, and sometimes I think as the left and progressives, we often kind of technocratic responses about legislation, etc. I'm not saying we should lie to people, but I think we need to try and show people what the world looks like and will look like if we win, both within our communities, but also to the people that they're targeting as well.
Thank you so much, Joe. And I know we have just little time left, so we're just gonna close, and we're very sorry that we didn't manage to cover all the questions, but I can also see the chat doing hefty amount and hefty lifting part of the work. So thank you everyone for being collectively working with us to get this conversation through. However, we're just closing. So we have a final one. What is the fractures that we can use within the far right, what we call the far right and alt-right, and linking that to this last point about resistance, just 1 minute each, if it's possible, and then anyway, I have a power to unmute also, so.
Could you repeat the question? Sorry.
What are some of the fractures within the far right that we can use within our resistance?
Oh, okay. Yeah, fractures. Okay, yeah. I think if we look at, say, 3 major crises right now, right? The genocide in Gaza, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and you could and climate change. In many ways, all 3 of these crises are crises created by the far right. Whether or not that's an far right Israeli government, whether or not it's an imperialist, expansionist Russian state, or whether or not it's people like Bolsonaro, etc., hacking away at the rainforests. And yet, despite them all being created, firstly, I think we should need to hang these crises around their necks internationally, but also there's fault lines within them. The far right are divided on all these issues. The people, the anti-Semitic far right say that they love Palestine, the Islamophobic far right elements say that they love Israel. There's fault lines there within parties and within groupings. The far right internationally is split on whether or not they support Ukraine or whether or not they support Russia. And there is also, oddly enough, splits where some people talk about they have pernicious kind of expansionist notions of ecology versus other ones that completely deny climate change. So I think there are fault lines there that we can exploit, despite the fact I don't mean exploit those crises, by the way. I mean we can exploit the global far right's perception and understanding of them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you so much to all our panelists. Thank you so much to the team behind the scenes, Jess Graham, my colleague at TNI, the entire TNI machinery, Raqib, Ailynn, my co-host, Maie, Noor, our organizing partner with the Transnational Institute. If you feel compelled to support this work, please follow the link in the chat and support our work. This is the 4th of 8 planned sessions. So next week, Wednesday, we will be meeting again. to look at are we headed to World War III? It seems the war drums are sounding in the distance, and what can we do about that? How can we organize? For every Goliath, said one of our panelists last week, there is a David. So be a David wherever you are. Let's fight back. This is a time not to relax and sit back. This is the time to stand up and resist. So everyone, please come together. Let's join the session next week. Let's remember the people in Palestine. Let's remember the people in the Congo. Let's remember the reasons why we do this work. Let's remember all the people that could gain from a more just and equitable world. Thank you so much. And indeed, never forget Sudan as well. I see in the comments. The world can be better. The world can be made in a different vision. And it is our task as the people here to make sure that that vision becomes a reality. Thank you very much for joining, and see you next time.